sun hung low over Lexington, Kentucky, casting a golden glow over the streets. Officer Chris Morgan adjusted his rear-view mirror as he sat in his patrol car, idly scanning the traffic ahead. His partner, Rachel Davis, tapped her pen against her notepad, jotting down observations from their earlier call. They were parked near Sunset Avenue, where the neighborhood transitioned from modest single-family homes to upscale condominiums. That's when Chris's eyes locked on a sleek black vehicle cruising past them. The driver, an African-American woman dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, had her hair neatly styled and her posture upright and poised. Something about the way she carried herself seemed to irritate Chris. "Look at that," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. "Fancy car, bet she's up to something." Rachel looked up from her notes. "She's not speeding or breaking any laws," she replied cautiously. "What's the problem?" Chris ignored her and reached for the flashing lights. "Let's find out," he said with a smirk, pulling onto the road behind the car. The driver slowed and signaled before pulling over to the side of the street. Her movements were deliberate, almost practiced. Rachel noticed her shoulders stiffen slightly. "Chris, this doesn't feel right," Rachel whispered as she hurried after him. "You don't even have probable cause." "Stay back, rookie," Chris snapped, his hand brushing against his holster. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I know a suspect when I see one." As they approached the window, it lowered, revealing Ava Carter. Her expression was calm but wary, her dark eyes assessing the two officers with quiet determination. "Good evening, officers," Ava said evenly. "Is there a problem?" Chris leaned in, his shadow falling across the interior of her car. "License and registration," he barked, ignoring her question. Ava's hands moved carefully to retrieve her documents, placing them on the dashboard before sliding them over. Rachel watched closely, noting the faint tremor in Ava's fingers. Her instincts told her something was off. Not with Ava, but with Chris. His demeanor had shifted from routine to unnecessarily aggressive. "What brings you to this part of town, Miss Carter?" Chris asked as he scanned her documents, his tone sharp. Ava tilted her head slightly, keeping her voice measured. "I'm on my way to a meeting." Chris's lip curled. Must be some meeting, driving a car like this. Rachel felt a knot form in her stomach. The tension was thick, and passers-by were starting to notice the interaction. She stepped closer to Chris. "Chris, she's cooperating. Let's not escalate this." But Chris was already pulling on the driver's door handle. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his grip tightening around the door. Ava's composure faltered for a moment. "Is there a reason for this?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. "I said step out," Chris growled, yanking the door open. Ava unbuckled her seatbelt, her movements deliberate, and stepped onto the pavement. Rachel's heart raced as she watched Chris grab Ava's arm with unnecessary force, pulling her to the side of the car. Ava stumbled slightly, catching herself against the door frame. "That's enough," Rachel blurted, stepping forward. Her voice trembled, but she held her ground. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Chris shot her a glare. "Stay out of this, rookie." Ava straightened her jacket, meeting Chris's glare head-on. "This is harassment, Officer Morgan," she said, her voice steady. "I know my rights." Chris smirked, leaning closer. "Out here, rights are what I say they are." Ava's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. Rachel, standing just a few feet away, felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Fear, anger, and a growing sense of responsibility. This wasn't just another traffic stop. This was something much bigger. The tension around the car felt like a storm about to break. Chris's grip on Ava's arm tightened as he shoved her closer to the side of the car. Her bag tumbled from her shoulder, its contents scattering onto the pavement. Keys, a phone, a small notepad. Ava exhaled sharply but kept her composure. "This is completely unnecessary," Ava said, her tone clipped but controlled. "I've complied with everything you've asked." Chris scoffed, crouching down to pick through her belongings without permission. His movements were deliberate, calculated, as if he was searching for something to justify his behavior. "What's a woman like you doing driving a car like this?" he muttered. Rachel stepped closer, her hands clenched at her sides. "Chris, this isn't protocol. We don't have probable cause to search her things." Chris waved her off, not even bothering to look up. "You've got a lot to learn, rookie. This is how you keep the streets clean." Ava's voice hardened. "Officer Morgan, you are violating my rights. You have no reason to search my property." Chris straightened, holding up one of her credit cards as if it were a piece of incriminating evidence. "You don't get to lecture me, lady. You're in my town now." A small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk, their murmurs growing louder. Several people had their phones out, recording the scene. Ava noticed but kept her eyes on Chris, refusing to look away. Rachel's chest tightened as she saw Chris step back toward the car, his hand sliding into his pocket. Her pulse quickened when she noticed a small plastic bag between his fingers, a bag he hadn't taken from Ava's belongings. "Rachel," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned into the car and slipped the bag under the driver's seat. Turning back to the crowd, he held up his hands dramatically, as if he'd just found a treasure. "Well, well," Chris announced loudly, holding the bag of white powder for everyone to see. "Looks like we've got a little drug situation here." Ava's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and anger flashing across her face. "That's not mine," she said firmly, stepping toward him. "You just planted that in my car." Chris smirked, his expression dripping with mockery. "That's a nice story, Miss Carter, but it's not going to hold up." The crowd murmured louder, their voices filled with disbelief. Rachel felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had seen it happen. Chris had planted the evidence. She knew it was wrong, knew she should say something, but fear kept her rooted in place. Ava turned her gaze to Rachel, her eyes pleading. "You saw what he did. Please, say something." Rachel's throat felt tight, her voice trapped somewhere between her conscience and her fear of retaliation. She could feel Chris's eyes on her, daring her to speak out. "Stay quiet," his gaze seemed to say, "or you'll regret it." But Rachel couldn't shake the image of Chris slipping the bag into Ava's car. Her father's words echoed in her mind, a lesson he'd drilled into her since she was a child. Integrity isn't easy, but it's what makes you a good person. "Chris," Rachel said, her voice trembling but audible, "this isn't right." Chris rounded on her, his face dark with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "Keep your mouth shut." Ava stood tall, her voice steady despite the anger coursing through her. "You can't intimidate your way out of this. I know exactly what's happening here, and so does your partner." Chris stepped closer to Ava, his hand resting ominously near his holster. "You think you're untouchable because you drive a nice car? Let me tell you something." "That's enough," Rachel snapped, louder than she intended. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't back down. "You're crossing the line." The crowd had grown larger now, and the weight of their stares bore down on the scene. Chris hesitated, glancing around at the onlookers. He clenched his jaw, but didn't say anything. Ava took a deep breath and looked at Rachel, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you for speaking up, but this isn't over." Rachel nodded, a spark of determination flickering in her chest. For the first time, she felt like she had the courage to take a stand. Chris's face twisted into a sneer as he turned his attention back to Ava. The crowd was still watching, phones raised, documenting every second. He leaned closer to her, his voice a low growl meant only for her ears. "You think you're smarter than me? You think these people are going to help you?" Ava met his glare head on. "I don't think, Officer Morgan. I know I'm smarter than you. And you just made the biggest mistake of your career." Chris's composure cracked for a moment, but he quickly masked it with a scoff. He pulled the handcuffs from his belt, stepping toward Ava. "You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance." Rachel felt her breath catch in her throat. This was it, the moment where she had to choose between her career and her conscience. Her father's voice echoed in her mind again. "If you don't stand up for what's right, you're just as guilty as the ones who do wrong." No, Rachel said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. She stepped between Chris and Ava, her hands raised defensively. "This isn't right, and you know it." Chris's face flushed with anger. "Move out of the way, rookie," he spat. "Don't make me report you for insubordination." Rachel's voice wavered, but she didn't move. "You planted that evidence. I saw you. I won't be a part of this." The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock spreading through the onlookers. Ava's expression softened slightly, her gaze locking on Rachel. "Thank you," she said quietly. Chris's fury boiled over. He stepped closer to Rachel, jabbing a finger toward her chest. "You're done, do you hear me? I'll make sure you never wear that badge again." Rachel squared her shoulders, summoning every ounce of courage she had. "If that's what it takes to do the right thing, so be it." Ava, sensing the moment was at its tipping point, decided to speak. "Officer Morgan," she said, her voice steady and commanding, "you might want to think carefully about your next move." Chris laughed bitterly. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Ava reached into her jacket pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. Both officers tensed, but Ava didn't flinch. She pulled out a leather badge holder and flipped it open, revealing her credentials. "My name is Captain Ava Carter," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I'm the new commanding officer for this precinct." For a moment there was only silence. Chris stared at the badge, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Rachel felt her knees weaken as the weight of the revelation hit her. That's not possible," Chris stammered, his confidence crumbling. You can't be—" Ava interrupted him. "You didn't even bother to ask before deciding I was a criminal, did you? But it shouldn't matter who I am. Every person deserves to be treated with respect, not judged by the color of their skin or the car they drive." Chris's face paled as the crowd erupted into murmurs. Some people cheered, others shouted angrily at him. The reality of what he had done, what had just been exposed, seemed to sink in. Rachel took a small step back, her mind reeling. Ava turned to her, her expression softening. "Officer James, I'm grateful you found the courage to speak up. It's not easy, but it's the right thing to do." Rachel swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "I should have done it sooner. I'm sorry." Ava nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "You did it when it mattered. That's what counts." Chris, still in shock, finally found his voice. "Captain, I can explain." "No," Ava cut him off sharply. "You can't. What you did today goes against everything this badge stands for. Hand over your weapon and badge. You're suspended effective immediately." Chris's hand shook as he unclipped his badge and holster. He glared at Ava, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. "You can't do this. You don't know what it's like out here. I've been protecting these streets for 20 years. Ava's expression didn't waver. "Protecting? Is that what you call this? How many lives have you destroyed with your prejudice, Chris? How many people have you framed to feed your ego?" The crowd, now emboldened by Ava's presence, began shouting for justice. A woman in the front yelled, "You're a disgrace to the uniform." Another added, "We've been dealing with this for years." Rachel glanced at the growing crowd, her nerves fraying. This wasn't just about Chris anymore. It was about a system that had let officers like him operate unchecked. Ava stepped forward, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the noise. "This isn't just about me," Ava said, turning to address the crowd. "It's about holding people like him accountable. It's about making sure that no one is above the law, not even the ones sworn to uphold it." Chris's face reddened as he took a step closer to Ava. "You think you're some kind of hero. You don't know what it's like to deal with the real criminals out here. You sit behind a desk while I'm out risking my life." Ava raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unwavering. "And you think that justifies planting evidence, using your authority to intimidate and degrade innocent people? You're not risking your life, Chris. You're ruining others." Rachel felt her chest tighten as she watched the exchange. She had always known there were cracks in the system, but seeing them this close was overwhelming. Ava turned her attention back to Rachel. "I know this isn't easy for you," Ava said, her voice softening, "but speaking up today took courage. Don't lose that." Rachel nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't." Chris, still holding his badge, looked at Ava with a mixture of resentment and desperation. "You're making a mistake, Captain." Ava stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "People like me? You mean people who believe in justice, who believe in equality? If that's a mistake, it's one I'll gladly make." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices drowning out Chris's protests. Ava turned to the nearest bystander and said, "Thank you for recording this. Make sure it gets shared." Chris's face twisted in fury. "You're throwing me under the bus for optics. This is all a show." Ava didn't flinch. "No, Chris. This is accountability, something you clearly don't understand." The wail of approaching sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of backup. Ava stood tall, her presence commanding as Chris reluctantly handed over his badge and holster. His shoulders slumped, and his bravado crumbled under the weight of what had just happened. Rachel watched a storm of emotions churning inside her. Relief, guilt, and a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. As another patrol car pulled up, two officers stepped out, their eyes darting between the crowd and the scene in front of them. Ava waved them over, her voice firm and clear. "Officers, escort Mr. Morgan to the precinct. He's suspended pending a full investigation." Chris's face turned a deeper shade of red. "You can't be serious. This is my precinct, my team." Ava didn't even look at him as she replied, "Not anymore." The crowd cheered as the officers reluctantly led Chris away. Some shouted words of support for Ava, while others demanded justice for the countless people Chris had wronged over the years. Ava turned to face the crowd, her voice rising above the noise. "This is just the beginning," she said, her tone resolute. "Today we're taking a stand against corruption and prejudice, but it doesn't stop here. It's up to all of us to demand accountability and ensure our system works for everyone." The crowd responded with a wave of applause and shouts of agreement. Rachel felt a lump in her throat as she realized the magnitude of the moment. This wasn't just about Ava or Chris, it was about the community reclaiming its trust in the people meant to protect them. As the scene began to wind down, Ava approached Rachel, her expression softening. "You did the right thing today," she said. "I know it wasn't easy." Rachel nodded, her voice barely audible. "I was scared. I didn't know if I'd lose everything." Ava placed a reassuring hand on Rachel's shoulder. "You didn't lose anything that matters. Integrity is what defines us, not the badge." Rachel blinked back tears, feeling a sense of pride she hadn't felt since she first joined the force. For the first time, she understood what it meant to truly serve and protect. A local news crew arrived, cameras already rolling. Ava took a deep breath, knowing the spotlight was about to shine brighter than ever. She turned to the camera, her voice calm but firm. "What happened here today is a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it," she said. "We have a long way to go, but change starts with moments like this." As the crew captured every word, Rachel stepped back, letting Ava take the lead. She glanced at the crowd, now dispersing, but leaving behind an air of hope and determination. For Rachel, this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she could finally live up to the oath she had taken. For Ava, it was a chance to reshape a broken system from within, and for the community, it was a spark that could ignite a larger movement for justice. The sirens faded into the distance as Chris's patrol car disappeared down the road. Ava and Rachel stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next.